Hi folks, and welcome to Attica Armory. In this video, I wanted to talk to you a little bit about hand loading your own custom precision long-range rifle ammo. And if there's only one thing that you take away from all of this, it's that the key to accuracy is consistency, and the key to consistency is to remove as many variables as possible. Just remember that none of this stuff will help if your barrel is all fouled up. So please remember to check out our citrus-powered synthetic CLP at Attica Armory. So just a little bit of background on my perspective here. I'm a 42-year-old U.S. Army veteran who's been teaching shooting in both military and civilian environments since 2013. I grew up learning marksmanship, hunting, and mountaineering in the beautiful Rocky Mountains. And I've been involved in custom gun work and hand loading for over 2 decades now. I'm also a Gemini. I enjoy long walks on the beach, sappy romantic comedies, and group yoga sessions in the park. Now, I don't want to imply that my way is the right way or the only way to do things. All I want to do is show you what I've found that works for me and hopefully save you some trial, error, and money as you get yourself up to speed with precision rifle loads. Now, let's talk about gear for a few. And just so you know, we have no affiliation with any of the manufacturers or distributors of these products. And we don't sell any of this reloading gear. This is just stuff that I use personally. And there's definitely a lot of gear options out there, so feel free to shop around for what best suits you. Now let's start off by talking about the foundational hand loading tool, the press. For precision rifle loads, I tend to prefer a solid single stage press like this Lee Breech Lock Challenger press. It has a full wrap frame, so there's no flex, and it's very easy to swap the dies out. And most importantly, it is extremely consistent. In general, automated or progressive presses don't seem to yield the same level of consistency that you'll get from an old school basic single stage press under the arm of a methodical OCD hand load nut job like yours truly. Another valuable tool is this Hornady lock and load OAL gauge. The less time a bullet spends jumping through the free bore and into the throat and ultimately into the lands and grooves of the barrel rifling, the more accurate it will be. And this tool will help you to determine the optimal overall length of your custom load by gauging the true distance to the lands of your specific barrel. This custom OAL can be a bit longer than conventional load specs. But hey, let's be honest, folks, who wouldn't appreciate just a little more length, right? And you can see here that the OAL gauge cases are threaded on the back, so these are specialty cases made just for this. One little word of warning on this is that your custom OAL might be significantly longer than the SAMI cartridge specs actually call for. This can cause serious issues with magazine-fed rifles, particularly autoloaders, as the cartridge may become too long to fit in the mag or it might bind during feeding. If that's the case, you may have some trial and error in finding the longest OAL that will still fit in your mag and feed reliably. For auto-loading precision rifles, I generally like to load rounds no longer than the max SAMI cartridge overall length to ensure proper function, and simply adjust the powder charge slightly if the original load called for a shorter OAL. Next up, you're going to want a quality scale that measures down to at least 1/10 of a grain. I wouldn't go too cheap on this tool, as your load consistency will probably pay the price. Make sure that you have some good calibration weights to calibrate every time you use it, and remember to check the calibration regularly throughout the loading session. That said, I have had good results with this decade-old RCBS Rangemaster 750, It seems to be very precise despite the occasional firmware quirks. A good analog scale would also serve you very well. Another handy item is a powder trickler like this Redding Model 5. This will allow you to add powder to the scale one kernel at a time, and it works particularly well with large kernel rifle powders and is essential to getting that powder charge just right. Now, despite being a bit of a tech junkie, I don't tend to actually trust electronics much. I don't really like all the electronic crap they put in my truck, especially in the drivetrain and the powertrain, and that's probably why I like using an analog caliper like this Tecton for precision loading. Aside from having kind of a cool retro vibe, I tend to trust it a bit more than the cheapo digital caliper because it relies primarily on hard mechanical connections with gears and teeth as opposed to electronic sensors. It's probably just my own perception and may not be based in reality at all, but what the heck? Everything's about feelings nowadays, and this just feels more trustworthy to me. Another critical tool is your crimping die. I've been using the Lee factory crimp die for many years with great success. A good case crimp is essential for guaranteeing a uniform starting pressure as it holds the bullet in place for longer and allows pressure to build up a bit before it begins its journey. This leads to a more complete and efficient powder burn and further reduces inconsistencies in muzzle velocity. For bolt actions and single shot rifles, I only apply a light crimp, maybe a quarter to a half the depth of a full crimp. This relieves stress on the case neck and causes less deformation to the bearing surface of the bullet. For autoloaders, I usually do a full crimp to avoid having any bullet setback when it slams against the feed ramp during feeding. Another item that you'll want to get if you haven't already is a decent set of manual case prep tools. Some reloading kits come with these little fingerling-sized deburring and primer pocket tools, but using them gets old really fast. If you have a lot of case prep to do, it's easy to get tired and start getting lazy, which leads to cut corners and poor consistency. Lyman makes a variety of nice prep tools that'll help make things a lot easier on your hands. On the other side of that, using motorized prep machines require a bit of extra care on its own, in that you don't want to go overboard while deburring the case neck. Remember, it only takes a tiny chamfer inside and outside the neck to do the trick. Alright, so you can see here our spread, 5-shot group, pretty nice. I mean, a couple of these are just stacked right on top of each other. I've got a little bit of vertical stacking going on, and maybe that might be, it could be temperature related. It is quite cold out here today, and as that barrel warmed up, between shots, it might have something to do with that. But overall, that's, under an inch, and I'm good with that. For a stock rifle, that's a great group. Let's talk about brass for a minute. When you're choosing brass, you basically have two broad choices. Option one, you can spend gobs of cash on high-end premium cases that offer the maximum geometric uniformity and metallurgical consistency. If you can float the bill for this, there's definitely some nice options out there. Or, option two, you can use standard cases like this Winchester brass, and you can simply sort them for uniformity yourself. A simple way to get consistent cases is to first do all of your cleaning, sizing, and trimming, and then go through and weigh 10 of your cases one at a time to get an average case weight. Once you get an average weight, you can then weigh all the cases individually and remove the ones that are grossly over or underweight. Just set those aside for less critical applications. You'll also want to remove any damaged or malformed cases or those with odd-shaped primer flash holes through a careful visual inspection. Out of a 500-piece lot of 308 cases, I ended up with about 300 that were adequately suited for precision loads, which is not bad considering the affordable price. One little side note on cases. I'm not a big fan of reusing NATO head-stamped cases for precision 308 loads for two reasons. One, they have a crimped primer, meaning that you have to remount the priming pocket prior to priming. Ooh, try saying that 3 times real fast. Primer pocket prior to priming. Okay, hang on, let me wipe off the spit from the microphone real quick. And two, they tend to use a thicker, more rigid brass that's harder to resize and seems to have a bit less case volume than commercial 308. In other words, some standard 308 powder charges can become compressed loads in 7.62 NATO brass. Moving on. When you're using brand new cases, I like to first run a full-length sizer and then fireform them in a specific rifle that I'm loading for. Fireforming is simply loading and firing them in your rifle one time so that the case forms to the chamber under the pressure of firing. After they've been fireformed, I only use those cases for that specific rifle, and I only use the neck sizing die from that point on. Neck sizing is a lot less stressful on the cases without the need for annealing or heat treating the neck, and will result in a longer case life compared to full-length sizing every single time. Also, fire-formed neck-sized brass tends to be more conducive to precision accuracy than full-length sizing due to the tighter initial fitting in the chamber. That said, if you're using an autoloader, full-length sizing is a safer bet to ensure good reliability. Alright, so here's another group, and that's pretty nice. That's under 1 inch right there. So again, just a tiny bit of vertical stacking, which, maybe, again, possibly barrel temperature related. Definitely, that the first couple of shots, that ammo is cold, and that barrel is cold, and it warms up pretty quick, so that could be what's causing that change in impact. But overall, that is a real solid group, and I'm good with that. Now, let's talk bullets for a few. Bullet designs have gotten pretty evolved over the years. In just a few decades, we went from very basic soft points or hollow points to having electronically bonded cores with colorful polymer ballistic tips and even high-tech bullet coatings built right in. One of my favorite big game bullets is the Nosler AccuBond, and it has most of these bells and whistles. It is an excellent bullet by any standard and has served me very well on numerous hunts. I've also tried a litany of other modern ballistic tip bullets from the likes of Hornady, Winchester, Nosler, etc. After spending more than a decade in ballistic tip world, I found myself drawn back to a cult classic, no other than the legendary Sierra Match King hollow point boat tail. The Match King number 2275 is a 175 grain 308 bullet that has been the go-to bullet for long-range competitive shooters for a very long time, and for good reason: complete and utter consistency. This bullet is just boringly predictable. And while the curse of boring predictability has been plaguing Hollywood movies since the Chinese government bought up all those big studios, it is actually a good thing when it comes to bullets. We want to know exactly what will happen next, with no surprises, twists, or turns in the plot. As with the brass, I like to weigh my bullets for consistency, and I've noticed that the Match King weight variance from one bullet to another is virtually non-existent. Furthermore, the dimensional aspects of the Match King, such as the arc of the ogive, that's the forward-facing shoulders of the bullet, tend to be more uniform, resulting in more consistent bullet seating, OAL, and of course, ballistic coefficients while it's in flight. Yeah, I'll admit, some of the fancy ballistic tip stuff does look better on paper, with higher ballistic coefficients and impressive terminal ballistics. But from what I've seen, it's not all rainbows and unicorns. They have some potential downsides when it comes to long-range precision shooting that you should be aware of. First and foremost is the factor of tip deformation that's caused by supersonic friction. If you've not heard about this, I'd recommend you read up on the saga of the Hornady AMAX. Somehow it was discovered, maybe by Mighty Mouse flying next to an AMAX in flight, that the AMAX tip was melting and deforming. As a longtime user of the AMAX, I was actually a bit relieved to hear this news, as I always wondered how I could produce sub-MOA groups at 100 yards, but it all went to Hades out past 500 or 600, even on a calm day shooting off the lead sled. It made sense to me that if the tip melted in flight, that the farther it flew, the more unstable the bullet would become. Now, I applaud Hornady for coming out and admitting to this publicly, as well as taking steps to reformulate the polytip and remedy the situation. They do appear to be a company that operates under principles of integrity. However, this left me to wonder, what other bullet tips are melting in flight that we don't know about? The next area of concern is weight consistency. And as I mentioned before, I weigh each bullet and I remove the outliers for serious precision loads. What I've found is that I have to discard a lot more polytip bullets than other standard designs like the Match King due to them having a much wider extreme spread in weight, as well as occasional visible inconsistencies in the tip. The bottom line is that I now reserve my polytip bullets for applications like big game hunting, in which I have a much larger target at much closer ranges. Let's move on to powder. Now, I don't want to get too caught up in what the best powder is because it can vary greatly from one rifle and cartridge combo to another. One thing I can say is don't assume that a powder that produces the highest velocities will necessarily be the best for precision long-range shooting. That's the case with my 300 Weatherby Magnum powder of choice, the IMR 4350. It is at least 150 feet per second slower than I can get with some others, but it is very accurate in my rifle, and I'll take an accuracy increase over a power increase any day of the week, especially when dealing with centerfire rifles that hit hard either way. When you're choosing a powder, it's good to pick one that's going to give you good case feel in your chosen cartridge and bullet weight. Then I work my way up to a charge weight that yields the best accuracy. I usually start about midway between the starting and the max load of a published load. For load development, I'll usually load at least 5 rounds of each charge weight, and I'll move up in half grain increments up to the max load. Then I'll shoot those 5-round groups of each charge weight in a cold barrel to see which one produces the best groups. Of course, I'm always looking for signs of excess pressure. I'm also running some through the chrono so I can see where my velocities are at. One thing that I've noticed over time is that running charge weights that are too extreme, either too mild or too hot, will negatively affect accuracy. Down on the low end of that, you have to have enough powder in there to reach the cartridge's proper operating pressure, and in turn have a consistent starting pressure, peak pressure, and average pressure that produces consistent muzzle velocities. Conversely, running loads that are too hot can also have negative effects on both accuracy and on barrel and brass longevity. So take your time and try to find that sweet spot that your rifle likes best. When weighing powder charges on my scale, I like to start about a tenth or two underweight and use the powder trickler to slowly work my way up until I just tip the scale to my desired weight. I find that this method delivers a more consistent powder charge than going overweight and then trying to scoop kernels out till I get down to my desired weight. As a basic rule of thumb, I generally try to avoid any volume-based charge measuring, like the scoops or the auto disc charger for precision loads. Loading by weight seems to be the way to go if you have a quality scale. So bear in mind that we're not using anything fancy out here today. We've got a bone stock Savage Model 10 precision carbine, and we also have basically an entry-level long-range scope. This is a Vortex Diamondback Tactical. It's a 624 by 50. And it's actually a really good scope. I've been happy with it so far. So, but basically, I mean, you know, the rifle is under $1,000 and the scope is like $400. So this is not any kind of a fancy setup here by any means. Now, let's talk about primers. Primers are pretty straightforward. And aside from making sure that your primer pockets and flash holes are clean, there are only a couple of added precautions that you need to take. First and foremost is to buy premium match grade primers if possible. They're not that much more money and they tend to be a little bit more consistent. Beyond that, you can also weigh your primers, come up with an average, and remove the extreme outliers as we did with the bullets and the brass. And one final precaution with primers: don't seed them too hard and too deep. Primers prefer a gentle, nurturing, one might even say caring touch. If you ram it in there like an overzealous bull on a first date with a pretty young heifer, you might pre-compress or displace some of that priming compound, which could result in slight ignition variances, again affecting operating pressures and ultimately increasing the extreme spread of your muzzle velocities. Remember, everything we're doing is to try and shave off tiny bits of each variable to make everything as uniform as possible. So even though it might seem like too small of a variable to even matter, it's the sum of all parts that come together and give you better consistency and improved long-range accuracy. And with that, we hope you enjoyed this video today. Please remember to give us a thumbs up and subscribe if you haven't already. And we'll see you again next time at Attica Armory.